Breaking free, a Nusra Front splits with Al-Qaeda, eyeing greater legitimacy in Syria. Also on today's program, as Brazil gears up for the Summer Olympic Games, we ask if global sporting events are a blessing or a curse for host countries. And in Picture This, pesky pests no more. Scientists release millions of mosquitoes in China to fight disease. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. It's a basic concept for organizations worldwide. When your messaging falls off track and your reputation is scarred, it's probably time to rebrand. Apparently, for armed groups fighting a civil war, it's no different. Syrian rebel group Nusra Front has parted ways with Al-Qaeda, changed its name and declared its independence from all other affiliations. It's a cleaning up shop of sorts for the heavily armed group left out of international peace talks, overshadowed by its notorious ties to Osama bin Laden's brainchild. But it's also being considered a strategic move met with Al-Qaeda's blessing, allowing its trained fighters to zero in on its fight against the Syrian regime and other rebel groups. Today's newsmaker is Nusra Front, as we ask how their rebranding will impact the war in Syria.
It may be significant that the leader of Jabhat al-Nusra decided to show his face for the first time. That Abu Muhammad al-Jilani felt the publicity and attendant danger was important in getting a message across. Jabhat al-Nusra is one of the biggest rebel groups in Syria, often referred to as Al-Qaeda in Syria. Al-Jilani may have made it plain that his group was splitting from Al-Qaeda, but there were clear signals he was not abandoning their ideology or indeed their style. Listed as a terrorist organization by the United States, Al-Nusra, along with Daesh, was excluded from a truce negotiated in February. A change of name, however, seems to cut no ice.
Hey everybody.
In Moscow or Washington.
I certainly see no reason to believe that their actions or their objectives are any different. And they are still considered a foreign terrorist organization.
The rebranding comes ahead of a widely anticipated agreement between Russia and the United States, whereby they could coordinate military attacks on the group that was known as Jabhat al-Nusra. The new name is Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, or Front for the Conquest of the Levant. They say they hope to foster unity among armed factions. The group that appeared in 2012 was seen as the most powerful one after Daesh. With tens of thousands of fighters, it controls many areas in the northwest of Syria. But exactly who controls what areas is still somewhat complicated. Vast swathes of the north along the Turkish border are controlled by the Syrian YPG. To the west and south of Aleppo are a variety of rebel groups, including the now named Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, whilst there are large areas that are a mix of Fatah al-Sham and also Daesh, located to the north of the capital Damascus. Aleppo, Syria's largest city, remains under siege. Rebel areas are being pummeled by Russian airstrikes. On Monday, a Russian military helicopter was shot down in an area controlled by al-Nusra al-Fatah. But there may be a growing sense of unity. The powerful Ahrar al-Sham group, about 20,000 strong, has suggested joining forces. Other smaller groups may consider following. And that's going to make it harder for the international community. If there's a unified body under a new rebel umbrella, any international action against its fighters could be seen as counter-revolutionary, effectively supporting the Assad regime. For the politicians attempting to bring to an end the horrific war that has raged for 5 years, this could be an added layer of complication to a seemingly intractable problem. Francis Collings, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Chicago is Azim Ibrahim, a fellow at Mansfield College and University of Oxford. Thanks a lot for joining us, Azim. Azim, is this a PR exercise? And if it is, does it have a lot of significance?
This is a very significant move, no matter which way you look at it. We only have to cast our eye back to the beginning of the Civil War, when both Daesh and Nusra Front were affiliated with Al-Qaeda as Al-Qaeda franchises. And now, half a decade later, both of them have split off. The principal motivation for the Nusra Front to split off can be divided into three categories. Essentially, they want to have a seat at the negotiating table in Geneva, which they have been prohibited from doing so because of their affiliation with the Al-Qaeda toxic brand. Secondly, the funding has dried up because of pressure from the US Justice Department, and they are hoping a lot of those funding avenues will reinvigorate themselves from the Gulf countries. And thirdly, after the ceasefire agreement in March, the Nusra Front, along with IS, were excluded simply because of they're designated as terrorist organizations. And this allowed the Russians to target them. And the situation on the ground is such that it's very difficult to know where one group ends and another group actually starts. And so you have essentially, under the pretext of targeting terrorist organizations, the Russians are able to target any group that they want under the pretext of targeting the Nusra Front.
Yeah, so I just want to sort of pick up on some of what you said and separate it out. But before that, can we agree on the fact that Jabhat Fatah al-Sham is basically, as they're now called, it's the same ideology as Al-Qaeda, but the main difference is that Al-Qaeda is global in its outlook, and these guys are, as far as they say, they are only focused on Syria. Is that the main difference?
Indeed, their ideology is exactly the same, essentially. The only difference is the fact that Jabhat al-Nusra, the new organization, is essentially focused exclusively on Syria, and they have made a very clear undertaking that they will not target Western targets. And they are hoping that this would essentially give them a seat at the negotiating table with the United States and other groups.
Okay, so then that second point that you made about funding, might it be true that countries like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, have been wanting for a long, long time for these guys to rebrand themselves and cut off those ties to Al-Qaeda so that they could justify giving them funds and weapons? Might it have been the other way around, where they succumb to pressure from the outside and potential funders?
You know, these negotiations have been going on for 1 year, and they have been under pressure from various countries in the Gulf to disassociate themselves from the Al-Qaeda brand so that these countries can actually continuously fund them. You know, at the moment they're prohibited from doing so because of pressure from the US Justice Department, but hopefully they are hoping that will now change.
And another point that you made, you said that Russia had been targeting them. One of the possible positives that they see from rebranding is that they'd be able to unify rebels. It might help them absorb other rebel groups. So let's look down the road. You have the US and Russia both agreeing to target al-Nusra and stay out of each other's way when they hit them. Now, if this new group, Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, joins forces with other groups that the United States doesn't consider terrorist groups, what does that do to the entire strategy of the United States, of Russia, and others? It's going to confuse the place, isn't it?
It is going to confuse the place, but the Nusra Front leadership is fully aware that they are looking, that the United States is not beyond the realm of possibility that the United States will sit down with them and negotiate the future of Syria with them. The US has, after all, sat down with other terrorist organizations, for example, the Taliban, for example, the PKK, who are a designated terrorist organization that have been targeting a NATO ally for some time. So they are fully aware that over the long term that there is a possibility that they will be recognized and they have a seat at the negotiating table. And as one of the most significant and largest military groups on the ground, you know, they are certainly hoping that they'll have a much more significant say in the future of Syria.
What would Assad be thinking right now, Azim?
I think Bashar al-Assad will probably be unaffected by this. You know, he believes that he has Hezbollah and he has Putin on his side. His ambition is now to recapture all of Syria in its entirety. And what happens elsewhere, you know, with the US and his allies, I don't think he really cares much about. He has the momentum, he has the ambition, and I think he's going to continue doing what he's doing.
We saw that when they made this decision, just before they made the decision to break away, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda, basically gave his blessing, right? And then in the photo op, we saw Jolani dress up and pay homage almost to Osama bin Laden. He dressed like him, he looked like him, even in his mannerisms and the way he spoke, he was similar to Osama bin Laden. What do you make of that, and what does that mean for the sort of evolution of these types of Al-Qaeda franchises around the world? Might we see similar groups elsewhere that are not Al-Qaeda but are Al-Qaeda, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, this is actually a blow to Al-Qaeda, no matter which way you put it. Al-Qaeda has essentially lost its affiliates in the largest theatre of jihad in the world, both Syria and Iraq. It has now essentially only got affiliates in Yemen, in Africa, and some very small ones in East Asia. So the Al-Qaeda brand is no longer carries the weight that it used to as a global jihad franchiser. And Ayman al-Zawahiri gave his blessing to this because he simply had no choice. The divorce from ISIS was quite brutal, and so they had to, one way or another, put a gloss to this. But in whichever way you put it, this is quite a blow to Al-Qaeda's leadership.
5 years down the line, is it possible to separate out rebels as extremists and moderates? Is that possible 5 years down the line?
It's going to be very difficult, I think, now, because the Nusra Front has essentially got the same ideology. The biggest advantage that they have is that it's composed principally of Syrians, and they can make the claim that they have Syrians, the interest of the Syrian people at its heart. Whereas ISIS and other groups, they're essentially made up of foreigners who, when the things turn wrong for them, they will essentially turn their heels and flee. Whereas the Nusra Front is made up of mostly Syrians, and they take very little foreign fighters within them, so they can claim to represent as an umbrella group the Syrian people in any political settlement.
They've lost fighters to Daesh in the past. Is that going to be less of a worry for them now, given the rebranding? Might fighters want to stay with them and not go and join ISIS?
There's already been many fighters within the Nusra Front who are very unhappy with this divorce from Al-Qaeda and have threatened to actually leave and join ISIS, and that, I think, that is a real possibility. However, over the long term, this is a very politically savvy maneuver from Jolani and a very strategic moves that they are looking over the long term over the future of Syria and a political settlement. And I think most of the fighters who are being of Syrian origin will be much more interested in that than just purely the ideology.
Azim, thanks so much for demystifying some of this for us. Azim Ibrahim joining us there from Chicago. Still to come on the Newsmakers, running the other way, why more countries are rethinking the benefits of hosting major sporting events. And in Picture This, mosquitoes to the rescue. The world's most loathed pests make their debut as disease fighters in China. It's the ultimate competition for nations vying for the world's attention. A chance to become home to one of the biggest public spectacles. Winning hosting rights to major sporting events like the Olympic Games and the World Cup is seen as a prestigious prize, attracting tourists, financial aid, and bragging rights. But it also comes with a hefty price. And more countries are wondering if the trade-off is really worth it. Pirovolakis explains.
Is hosting the Olympic Games like throwing the world's biggest and most expensive party? Doping and security may be a headache for the International Olympic Committee, but the biggest threat to the future of the Games could be to find cities willing to host them. Out of the 6 who submitted bids for the 2022 Winter Olympics, 4 dropped out. Oslo and Stockholm said it was too expensive. Ukraine's war put an end to Lviw's bid, and Krakow in Poland withdrew from the race after its residents said no in a referendum. Numerous other cities, including Munich, Davos, and Quebec City, considered bidding, but abandoned the idea due to the lack of public support. So Beijing and Almaty were the only 2 left in the running. Beijing won, although it's hardly known as one of the world's great winter sports resorts. And it's not just the winter cities. Germany nominated Hamburg for the 2024 Summer Olympics, but its residents voted to withdraw in a referendum. Toronto's proposed bid was scrapped when the city's Economic Development Committee voted against it. And Rome's bid is in trouble as the new mayor refuses to back it. Paris, Budapest, and Los Angeles are still in the running. So why doesn't anyone want to host the Olympics anymore? Costs are a good place to start. The IOC promises an economic boom, but many cities have been left with big debts. It took Montreal 30 years to pay off the 1976 Games. The total bill for Vancouver's 2010 Winter Olympics came to $6.4 billion. Sochi, where venues and infrastructure had to be built from scratch, ended up costing the Russian government a whopping $51 billion. But despite the hefty price tag, the Olympics can also be a coming-out party for the host city and leave a lasting legacy. The 1992 Olympics put Barcelona on the map. The Olympics in Beijing helped the country emerge as an economic superpower. And London's Summer Games transformed the city's East End and even left the country with a profit of $87 million. Athens represents perhaps the greatest fear of other host cities. The city went almost $10 billion over its budget for the 2004 Games. The Greek capital benefited from much-needed transport infrastructure. But many of the venues now lie decaying and unused. Many suggest the massive cost overruns sparked the financial crisis that Greece is still dealing with today. Last year, the IOC pushed through reforms to reduce the cost of bidding and staging the Games. Candidates are now encouraged to use temporary or existing venues. The Rio balance sheet will be under close scrutiny by would-be hosts to help them decide whether the Games are a blessing or a curse. Pirovolakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Athens is Greek political analyst Yanis Kotsoumidis, and from Barcelona is global communications consultant with the United Nations, Rosa Surignac. Thanks both of you for joining us. Yanis, let me start with you. Is it a blessing or a burden for Rio to host these Olympics?
Well, we have to take into account whether the country that's hosting the Games has significant infrastructure in place or it has to build everything from scratch. For a small country that has to have enormous construction being done to host the Games, I think it's a big cost. However, Greece was the initial host of the Olympic Games in the ancient era, so it saw it as a duty to host the Olympic Games. We have to take into account that the transportation system that's been built in Athens and also big streets were built for the Olympics, and now every citizen and also tourists are taking advantage of these constructions. However, there was no comprehensive plan on what to do with all these venues, and most of the venues are lying without any use and become host now for refugees. One of the biggest venues, Olympic venues right now, is hosting more than 2,000 refugees in the outskirts of Athens. So we have to see if there is a plan on how to use the infrastructure, how to benefit from the publicity of the country, and how to make the people more getting accustomed with sports and sporting life, because this is another way of seeing the Olympic Games, is changing the way of life.
Okay, so Yanis has a lot of worries as to what's ahead for the Brazilians. And of course, nobody wants them to repeat the mistakes of the Greeks. Rosa, you believe that hosting the Olympics put Barcelona on the map. Tell us why.
Absolutely, absolutely. Hello, good afternoon from Barcelona. So yeah, that's the thing, that's the story, and I couldn't be more agree in the sense that it always depends on the situation and the context, and especially in how you are managing all these resources. So what I can say from the experience that we could live in Barcelona is that, of course, I mean, the kind of city that we are having now is due to the Olympics of 1992. So it means that it's a city that when you think of Barcelona, it's a city that's the creative city, young city, open to the sea, with a lot of things to do, multicultural, all these kind of things came due to the Olympics. And I think that it was because there was a vision. I mean, there was a board of management basically led by the municipality of the city, and this is one of the things that perhaps is different from others, that they were using, to say it in a way, they were using the Olympic to transform the entire city. But the transformation was not only in terms of infrastructure, was more about a social change. So it was about how to change neighborhoods that there were the poorest one in the city. It was about connectivity and mobility and access to services. It was about participation and civic engagement. So all these things made, I think, the success of the Olympics at that time.
Right. Let's look at the opportunities, Yanis, for the Brazilians. So you have a country in economic trouble. Rio itself, the local government, is bankrupt there. So might there be a chance through tourism, through jobs, through investment in infrastructure, to lift the economy not only locally, but broadly speaking for the entire country? Is there an opportunity for the Brazilians, Yanis?
I see there is an opportunity, but there has to be very good management of the Olympic Games, because we see very worrying incidents of crime and pollution in Brazil. So the authorities there need to take care of the tourists. We have to be sure, they have to be sure that there won't be any serious crime, because back in Athens in 2004, there was no incident of crime. Everybody was very pleased, and the visitors were safe. Now, if we have, and I hope there's no incident, but there is a real worry of safety for the visitors and also pollution. If the authorities manage to have a good management of the games, maybe it could be an attraction for tourists to come back and experience Rio and Brazil the way it is, and not only the venues, to go to also cities, other cities of Brazil as well. It could be an opportunity for Brazil if we don't have any negative incidents there.
Rosa, did the Brazilians miss the opportunity during the World Cup 2 years ago? Because there must be a clue in the fact that Brazil hosted the Football World Cup, which is arguably on a bigger scale than the Olympics because it involves multiple cities, and that did nothing to stop the financial slide, the slide in crime, and so on. So might people also be very apathetic to say, hey, it failed 2 years ago, why is it going to work now?
Yeah, perhaps it was because the World Cup was understood as a sports event only, you know? So it was understood as something that was happening in Brazil in relation to soccer, in relation to football, and that's all. So perhaps this is one of the mistakes or the challenges that needs to be understood in another way. So the fact of having an event like the Olympics could be understood as a thing that is happening in your country, in your city, in your region, whatever, that can bring you training, capacity building, also, and can empower also the people that is living there. So I remember, for instance, in Barcelona, that one of the main things that makes the event successful was the fact that a lot of people, I mean, all young people, was involved and was participating to the Olympics as volunteers. I mean, and it was not only the fact that they were working for free for an international event. It was the fact that they were trained and they were learning how to manage the kind of work that they were doing together, and they were like the hope of a new situation, the hope that a new kind of future was coming. So I think that's the difference. I mean, if you are treating the event only as a sports event, or if you are treating something in a different way that can also bring prosperity to the citizenship that is living there.
Right, that's a great point. So let's hope that these Olympics are efficient, uplifting, inspiring, and most importantly, lucrative and sustainable for the Brazilians. Thank you very much, Yanis and Rosa. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Good to talk to you. In today's picture this, most people would flinch at the idea of living on an island infested with millions of mosquitoes. We hate them, right? But for the scientists in China that are breeding the bloodsuckers, it's a chance to try and cure some of the world's most deadly diseases. Let's take a look. Today's newsmaker was on Nusra Front as we asked how their rebranding will impact the war in Syria. The Syrian rebel group has broken off from Al-Qaeda and renamed itself Jabhat Fatah al-Sham. For some, it's been a long time coming, and an attempt to shed its designation as a terrorist organization by Western powers. But it's also being considered an amicable strategic move, allowing them to more closely focus on their fight against the Syrian regime. Only time will tell if a new name also means a new game, or if the group's actions will simply make them a glorified Al-Qaeda in Syria. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. As always, thank you for watching. See you soon. Bye-bye.